Right, so Donald Trump's declaration that the joint US-Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities had obliterated Tehran's program was meant to be memorable, wasn't it? It was meant to be emphatic. We won. Iran got handed its backside on a plate, that kind of thing. It was an assertion meant to resonate not just in Washington, but in Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Brussels as well, conveying a message of American power in the face of the West's supposedly greatest threat. The claim that Iran's nuclear ambitions had been set back years, if not decades, was politically convenient. It allowed Trump to posture as the architect of a decisive military success and gave Israel a propaganda victory to bolster its own narrative of existential self-defense. However, the boastful rhetoric now lies in absolute ruins if you ever bought into it to begin with. Only one of the three targeted facilities, Fordo, sustained significant damage, it seems, the one the bunker busters were used on, while Natanz and Isfahan survived largely intact, it seems, with repair work potentially already underway. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has predicted that Iran could resume enrichment at these sites within months, very much in line with the Iranian claims up until this point as it happens. The gap between the public narrative and reality is not just a matter of embarrassment, though. It's emboldened Iran to push back on the US narrative even harder. They maintain they'll be back up and running in months, but it's also provided Benjamin Netanyahu with ammunition to push for further escalation, knowing as we do that he wants to go back into Iran, and it's trapped Trump in a bit of a political dilemma all of his own making, where he may now feel compelled to tacitly support another round of strikes to salvage his credibility. Right, so in attempting to cripple Iran's nuclear capabilities, Washington and Jerusalem may have managed to achieve the exact opposite, strengthening Tehran's resolve to advance its peaceful nuclear research program, leaving it with plenty of capability to do so, and setting the stage, unfortunately, for round two of a regional conflict that could prove far more dangerous than the nuclear facilities they sought to destroy. The strike targeted three of Iran's most critical nuclear facilities, as we know, Fordo, Natanz and Isfahan. On paper, this operation was billed as a decisive, preemptive measure, drawing comparisons to Israel's past successes at Asiraq in Iraq in 1981 and Syria's Al-Kabar reactor in 2007. Yet those historical parallels only highlight how far this operation actually fell short. Fordo, buried deep inside a mountain, was the only real success. US bunker-busting munitions collapsed several centrifuge halls, destroying advanced IR-6 and IR-8 centrifuges. Pentagon assessments estimate Fordo could remain offline for 1 to 2 years. However, Iranian countermeasures, including the dispersal of equipment to auxiliary underground halls, may shorten this timeline. It depends how much stuff they managed to move and where it ended up. Reports from the Cradle and Reuters confirmed that Fordo was the only site to sustain significant long-term damage, but even there, assessments indicate the destruction was not total. While key centrifuge cascades were destroyed, much of the facility's infrastructure does remain intact, and Iranian engineers are believed to be assessing ways to restore at least partial functionality. It's also been suggested that Iran may compensate for Fordo's reduced capacity by accelerating repairs at Natanz, where critical centrifuges were allegedly moved to before the strikes, and by expanding operations at other enrichment sites. Natanz was the primary enrichment hub. It suffered far less than expected, though. Anticipating strikes, Iran had already moved critical centrifuges and enriched uranium stocks to alternative locations. Satellite imagery published by AP News and analysed by the IAEA shows bulldozers clearing debris and construction equipment on site just weeks after the attacks. Far from being devastated, therefore, Natanz is likely to resume full operations within months, not years or decades, as Trump claimed, and confirming a Reuters assessment that the strikes may have delayed Iran's program only a few months. Isfahan, which is essential for uranium conversion, was barely touched, apparently. According to Reuters and the Washington Post, the strikes damaged only auxiliary infrastructure there, leaving its core functionally almost fully intact. Iran has presented Isfahan's survivability as evidence of its defensive resilience, further undermining the credibility of US claims. The contrast with previous nuclear strikes is instructive, though. Israel's 1981 attack on Iraq's Asiraq reactor was a textbook case of a preemptive strike achieving its aim. Asiraq was above ground, under construction, lacked hardened defensives. A single precision raid destroyed it completely, setting back Iraq's nuclear ambitions for years. Similarly, in 2007, Israel's Operation Orchard targeted Syria's Al-Kabar reactor, which was in its early stages of development and similarly vulnerable to the Iraqi site. Iran's program, by contrast, has evolved precisely to avoid those fates. Decades of threats from Israel and the US pushed Tehran to disperse its facilities, bury them under mountains, and harden them against aerial assault. As Business Insider has noted, this redundancy and fortification means military strikes can, at best, delay, but not eliminate. Iran's program, the failed attempt to replicate the Assyriac and Al-Kabar successes, all underscores a fundamental strategic miscalculation and a westernized arrogance too. That what worked in the 1980s and 2000s cannot work against a state that has spent 2 decades designing its program to withstand such attacks, and is far cleverer and more advanced and capable than was ever assumed. Iran's survival is the result of years of meticulous planning. The Fordo facility, for example, is buried under 80 meters of rock, requiring specialized munitions to breach it. Even then, Fordo's design incorporates multiple redundant holes, meaning that destroying one section does not automatically cripple the whole facility, which also means that the alleged damage done there may still not actually be accurate. Natanz's resilience owes much to decentralization. Iranian engineers have constructed underground halls not previously identified by Western intelligence, making complete destruction, again, almost impossible without a sustained bombing campaign. Moreover, Iran's pre-strike preparation, relocating centrifuges, moving uranium stockpiles, and installing decoy infrastructure, shows that Tehran anticipated the strikes and executed an effective counter-survival plan. These technical realities explain why the IAEA's Rafael Grossi confidently stated that Iran could resume enrichment within months. The strikes achieved disruption, but not destruction. Trump's insistence on selling the strikes as a historic success has backfired spectacularly, therefore. In the immediate aftermath, White House briefings described the operation as the most decisive blow ever dealt to Iran's nuclear ambitions, while Pentagon officials privately briefed journalists on a 5-year setback. Yet within days, leaked intelligence began to contradict these claims, and now the intelligence has, it seems, been verified. Factcheck.org exposed the discrepancy, pointing out that only Fordo sustained long-term damage. Natanz and Isfahan were operationally salvageable. A Senate Intelligence Committee briefing exposed bipartisan frustration, with even Republican hawks admitting privately that the strikes had not met their stated objectives. The domestic backlash has been amplified by Trump's political opponents, who accuse him of knowingly exaggerating for some electoral gain. Even some conservative media outlets have expressed skepticism, hinting at a growing rift between Trump's narrative and the simple facts of the matter. Internationally, the credibility gap is even starker. European diplomats, already wary of Trump's unilateral approach and combined with his casual relationship with reality, expressed frustration at being misled. The Council on Foreign Relations noted that the gap between rhetoric and reality risks eroding Washington's diplomatic leverage in future nuclear negotiations, as allies may no longer take US intelligence at face value. For Iran, the strikes have now become something of a political gift, therefore. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has denounced them as a crime, framing Iran as the victim of Western aggression while promising retaliation if further attacks occur. And many people, despite the mainstream media's best efforts, very much concur with that, very much see Iran as having acted in self-defense as Israel attacked them unprovoked. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has taken a much more measured tone, acknowledging serious damage at Fordo, but stressing that repairs are underway and enrichment is going to resume soon there as well. Domestically, this has strengthened hardliners at the expense of moderates who had advocated for diplomacy, though. Iranian state media portrays the strikes as proof that the US can't be trusted. It bolstering calls for greater self-reliance, and you can hardly blame them for that, actually. There's increasing discussion amongst Iranian hardliners of accelerating enrichment as a deterrent now. I don't think that's necessarily the wisest way to go. But with some even suggesting the strikes prove Iran must pursue a nuclear weapon outright now, which, as a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, Iran cannot do, not to mention the religious fatwa in place by the Supreme Leader. But this is still a conversation being increasingly had. Intercepted communications indicate that Iran deliberately downplayed the damage in public while privately acknowledging the setbacks, suggesting a strategy of projecting strength to deter further attacks. Netanyahu has seized on the limited success of the strikes now to justify his current argument that Israel must act again, decisively, against Iran's nuclear program, all despite Israel getting hammered by Iran emphatically last time. The Begin doctrine, which underpinned the Assyriac and Al-Kabar strikes, remains central to Israeli strategic thinking. Any regional adversary approaching nuclear capability must be stopped by force if necessary, even though Iran's research is not military. They have, in fact, made significant recent breakthroughs in cancer treatment through their nuclear medicine program, for example. Politically, Netanyahu has every incentive to escalate again now, though. Facing corruption trials, his coalition government fracturing, now running a minority coalition administration as the United Torah Judaism Party and Shas have left the coalition, and mass protests on top of that happening in Israel, a renewed military campaign offers a way to again distract from his domestic woes. Reports suggest that Netanyahu was already pushing for a second wave of strikes before the US intelligence leaks, arguing that Washington had already left the job unfinished. Yet there is caution within Israel's security establishment, contrary to Netanyahu's words. The IDF and Mossad officials warn that further strikes could provoke a massive retaliation, which Iran are very much promising if Israel try it. Israel may be prepared to strike again, but it risks triggering a broader regional conflict if it does, and Iran are unlikely to be as quickly and easily placated as last time to stop. Trump now finds himself trapped by his own rhetoric. To admit the strikes failed would shatter his ego. He's far too thin-skinned to admit fault, isn't he? Yet doing nothing risks further humiliation, especially if Iran visibly resumes enrichment shortly. Backing further Israeli strikes, even quietly, would allow Trump to claim he needs to finish the job, but Iran isn't enriching again yet, and Netanyahu is demanding something be done now. Given Trump's history overriding Pentagon caution to order the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, for example, or deferring to Netanyahu on key policy decisions, it is likely he will support Israeli escalation, at least covertly. Possibly not until the time is right, but Netanyahu has problems now, doesn't he? And he doesn't want to wait. Logistics and intelligence sharing could resume even if Washington publicly denies direct involvement, and given that it was only the strike on those nuclear sites that Trump went for last time, short of doing so again, the US may well stay out of it. Though, of course, another angle to this narrative that can't be ignored was the recent talk of the US selling Netanyahu the very B-2 bombers and bunker-buster munitions the US used to strike those sites. The strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities were meant to restore deterrence and demonstrate US-Israeli resolve. Instead, they have exposed the limits of military power against a state that has spent decades preparing for such an attack. By exaggerating the success of the operation, Trump has undermined his own credibility, emboldened Iranian narratives, not to mention mockery, and handed Netanyahu the perfect excuse to push even harder for further escalation. If Natanz and Isfahan resume enrichment within the predicted timeline, Trump's narrative of obliteration will be obliterated itself. It will be remembered not as a triumph, but as a symbol of strategic miscalculation and his own stupidity for aligning himself with Netanyahu the way he has. But then, the AIPAC money and the like does speak volumes, doesn't it? It may, apart from anything else, be walking the US into further stupidity at Netanyahu's behest. Of course, it is not only this latest report of the actual damage on Iran's nuclear facilities that have elicited Iranian mockery at Netanyahu's expense, but also his appearance on Fox News did too, with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi very much shredding him for it with the most caustic and perfect response he possibly could come up with. Get all the details of that rather humorous story, a bit lighter, in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.